Hello, everybody, and welcome. We know many of you, this isn't your first meeting based on the attendees list. Got a couple more trickling in. So just really quickly, we've got some governance over this meeting, both the Linux Foundation antitrust policy and the Cardea Code of Conduct. Because we don't have a lot of new people here, I'm going to leave the discussion to that. I've put a link to the meeting notes in the chat. If you want to go review those policies, just be nice is the shorthand. We also have a lot of familiar faces, so I don't know that we need to do introductions, but we can do a quick call. Anybody want to introduce themselves today? Say hi. Hopefully wherever you are is not too hot. It is sweltering here on the East Coast today. We had a cactus in our weather picture, which doesn't make sense because we live in the East Coast, but nonetheless, here we are. Let me share my screen and we'll jump in. Oh, there's Christy. Okay. So today, oh, there's some more coming in. Welcome, welcome for those of you who have just joined us. So today's agenda, this is the first Thursday of the month of August. Hard to believe we're in August already. But we just want to do quick housekeeping. I was just chatting with Tim. We are a little behind in getting meeting recordings updated on the Cardea website. So we'll try to get that taken care of soon so that we're caught up and it's only the net new that needs to get added. So apologies for being a little bit behind on that, but we'll get that resolved shortly. With that, we can jump into a quick high-level overview of the what is Cardea. Is there a question? Oh, nope. Okay. So this is a slide deck that we have used before. I'm going to just pull it up and sorry, go here. So here we have our trust triangle. We have on the left-hand side an issuer, and we'll talk about, we spent last meeting renaming some of our agents. That will show up on the next slide. So we have an issuer. This in this Cardea use case is some kind of healthcare related entity. So that might be a lab, it could be a health information exchange or an immunization gateway, for example. They establish a connection with a holder, which to them is a patient. That patient then changes their role once they've have the data in their hand, and they might use that data in other healthcare settings or in non-healthcare settings where they become a person that just is carrying some medical data about themselves. So this patient person here, who's the holder in this workflow, can then take their credential with them for the purposes of verification. Now, what makes this credential verifiable is that when the issuer becomes an issuer in the trusted digital ecosystem, they're writing to a public ledger information about themselves as an issuer, including, for example, their key, so that the decryption of the credential can be verified in terms of its authenticity as being issued by that, distributed by that issuer is verifiable based on the decryption key that's needed. And this data is being taken to a verifier. Again, depending on the nuances of the use case, this verifier, for example, might be some kind of checkpoint in the travel workflow. This could be, a school-based healthcare system that needs to verify that you've met criteria based on health data. Ken, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you did an excellent job. I think you mastered the nuances of verifiable credentials.
We are getting very good at describing this triangle. So what is fun about these slides, which should not be foreign to those who have been in these meetings before, these slides have been updated based on, I think, I'll double check, the naming conventions. Nope, I clearly did not update this one. Oh, I thought I copied the updated ones. apologies. They will be updated with the new naming conventions that we've given based in last week's meeting for each of the agents, which is just effectively a tool or a block of code that helps you do all of the cryptographic management that is required to participate with verifiable credentials. The underpinnings of the interactions between these agents is dependent on schemas, and given our attendee list today, we're going to spend a little time diving into schemas today. So we'll talk about those in depth, but they effectively define the structure and content that's being exchanged between these parties for certain things. And so everybody knows what to expect in those messages and therefore what to do with them. Another underpinning is our machine readable governance that allows for some of the interactions and decisions to be written into the code. You could also call those actions. So who's allowed to be an issuer, who's allowed to be a verifier, what would constitute as a yes, you're okay to move forward based on the content of your verifiable credential, or you did not meet the criteria as defined by the ecosystems and the verifiers.
Primary consideration for the governance is to establish trust. And it's done through identifying parties and what their roles are. So issuer, verifier, and workflows that show the schemas being interchanged in the verifiable credentials between the different parties. So establishment of trust is the primary consideration.
Excellent. Okay. I also wanted us to cover in sort of a general sense the Cardea interopathons. These have become a real pillar of the work that we're doing in driving the success of our community. So just a quick overview, our goals are to drive adoption and participation, to facilitate connectivity, and also to share our successes so that and overcome challenges together. So that we can each learn from each other. There's a lot of space, a lot of room for everybody in this ecosystem. And so sort of rising tide floats all boats concept. Everybody should be welcome, and being successful is valuable to all of our success. We've been holding these via Zoom and in breakout rooms. Each interopathon, of which we've had 3 so far, we've gotten really positive feedback on this structure. So we will continue to do that. We've had some recommendations that maybe we could organize a hybrid model in the future, and we'll keep that in mind as other verifiable credential events occur and maybe align with our schedule. The structure and format includes being able to test against Cardea reference code. That can happen in advance, but it is also part of the beginning of the interopathons, and then testing against compatible other organizations. So for example, if somebody brings a holder application, then we might align them with someone who is either an issuer or a verifier, depending on what's available there. The format includes activity before the event, so that, as I mentioned, is available in reference code that can be accessed prior to the activity. We also have held office hours. They have not been well attended, but staff can be available to help overcome any friction points that occur in anticipation of the interopathon. And then we've used these committee cycles to do walkthroughs of the code, to review in advance what will be different in each interopathon as we prepare for those events. And then during the event, we have a lot of fun, and first and foremost, and second of all, we're trying to identify areas of friction. So where do we hit some stumbling blocks, and what can we do as a community to overcome those? Some of them have been core issues in the interop profile that Cardea is using. There was ambiguity in optional code pieces, and they needed to be defined explicitly for the use of Cardea, as well as helping people troubleshoot their specific solutions roadblocks. And so we've done connectivity testing. This has been really important, especially as the Aries community moves to out-of-band connections. We've been helping facilitate that. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Aries is adopting some of our wonderful interopathon procedures so that they can do more of that testing within their community directly, but we've helped facilitate that just mostly because it didn't exist and it's part of the flow requirements. And then we've been testing the specific Cardea workflows. So these are the healthcare pathways in terms of issuance and verification. Ken, any comments on our Interopathon events, or those of you who have participated, maybe you want to chime in?
I think you summarized them in a most excellent way.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, moving on. We've discussed use cases. I'm going to skip ahead to our next slide, which is our extension use cases. So we're actively exploring the expansion of our initial use case that was in the travel workflow where you needed health data to facilitate travel. And we're exploring these extension cases where effectively all of the fundamental pieces that we've built to support that flow can be applied to slightly different use cases. And the ones that we've highlighted here are verification for education and employment. So for example, if you want to go to a higher education like college level, you need a meningitis vaccine. And so being able to prove that you've had that vaccination through verifiable credentials is a really easy use case for us to pivot to. In fact, it's not even a pivot, it's just use of the core components that we've built through Cardea. And we'll discuss that a little bit further as we dive into the schema review that we'll be doing in a few minutes. Additionally, although a little bit more complex, is the concept of employment drug testing as a requirement. This one comes with nuances only because substance use data does tend to have additional consent and governance rules applied to it. Those may not be as applicable in the space of employment, but nonetheless, it does add a flavor of complexity. Those are largely lab tests. Again, the Cardea framework does support a generic lab schema that would be beneficial to this use case as well. And there's a lot of economies to gain in this one because if you're an employee, for example, at a rideshare company, you are usually engaged with more than one, right? People flip between which one has the better pricing at the time. And so both of those organizations may require that you do these tests. We could perhaps identify these economies where you could do it once and the same test result could be verifiable and used by both. So that's another one that is a clear extension of what we're already doing with Cardea. With that said, perhaps we jump in to schemas. So first, let me tell you how I got to where I am now. I'll just show you, Cardea.app. I went to GitHub, and this Cardea generic label gets us to our schemas. So that's where you can find these later. I can also just put a link in the chat for those of you who may want to follow along or review them in more depth later. So we have identified a handful of schemas that are part of this ecosystem today. We have a lab order schema. This one's purpose in life is that you have started the process of the test. So you've had it ordered. You may not have the results yet, but it's in process. And so there may be some use cases where that is really beneficial. For example, monkeypox right now, the time from actually getting the test to getting your results is very delayed. And so knowing that you got tested might be really beneficial before you, for example, got your results back. Excuse me. The lab result schema, apologies. The lab result schema is for when the lab comes back as a result. So now it's been resulted by that lab agency, or the results are available through another trustworthy and qualified issuer. to be able to publish, that's not quite the right word, but to be able to issue the credential based on the lab results. We'll dive into each of these momentarily. A medical release credential is the idea that when you first establish a relationship with an issuer, you're authorizing them to distribute your data using these credentials. And so it helps both verify the identity of that individual, and establish the relationship and the permission for the issuer to connect with that patient in this context, and issue those clinical-based credentials. I'm going to skip this one for a second. We're going to talk about vaccination schema. The vaccination schema is designed to handle the issuance of any vaccine or immunization record. It is not specific to any one condition. So, for example, as we are navigating this new monkeypox emergency, as they've declared in New York, at least, a monkeypox vaccination could be supported by this, just like any other immunization record could be as well. And then we have a vaccine exemption schema to support the idea that somebody may have a medical condition or religious or otherwise granted exemption from getting a specific vaccination. And so that would provide evidence of that authorization to not have a vaccine. And then just going back to our last one, we have a trusted traveler schema. Again, this name of this schema was derived from the initial use case that Cardea was tackling, which was the travel use case. I think one of the items that we're hoping to accomplish, piggybacking on last week's discussion where we renamed some of our agents, we also need to think about how a derivative credential, right? The trusted traveler was granted after evaluation of the other credentials to say, we've checked your health criteria and we're going to issue a sort of neutral, a neutral derivative credential that does not expose and continue to expose PHI and PII, personally identifiable information and personal health information, to unnecessary verifiers that just need to know you're okay or you're not okay without getting into the details. And so this is certainly one that we'll want to talk about in terms of derivative credentials and what we may anticipate with those moving out of just a travel use case. Any comments on the family of schemas that we have so far? Okay, so with that, we can dive into them. So maybe I'll just take a poll. Do we want to do a walkthrough of the clinical-based schemas, or should we jump to the concept of the trusted traveler and potentially exploring renaming that one and redesigning it?
I think we've done a good job with most of the schemas, making them generic. And I don't think we need to go through lab order, lab result, medical release, or vaccinations or vaccine exemptions. Those have all turned out quite well, and I don't think need a lot of attention. Is there anyone who disagrees with that?
I do think there's one comment which we can table certainly for the purpose of today's discussion around as we expand and extend the use cases of Cardea, how do we expect a patient to communicate to an issuer what they're looking for, right? They may be looking for something specific. They may be looking for all of their medical data. You know, right now we only have this handful of schemas, but they may be looking for more. Are they looking for, a COVID vaccine? Are they looking for a monkeypox vaccine? Do they want all their vaccines? Figuring out how we tackle that communication, I think, will be important, whether that's through other protocols or
it's probably through the question and answer protocol. And but we can have a longer discussion about how to make the workflow happier or smoother or more understandable. And I think that's something good. I think also we've missed one type of credential that might be involved that's related to the medical release, and that's a consent. credential, and that's something that we can put on the list for discussion as well. But I do think you've identified the first key issue, and that's is it a trusted traveler or an authorization credential or something else?
Okay. Other comments?
I just wanted to say I've been pleased and also surprised at how resilient the health schemas have been so far. There are many other cases where we've had to make updates in a matter of a couple months, and the fact that they're running on, looks like 11 months without changes in that change history on the right there. That's pretty awesome. So, and then my guess is that we might have a slightly different version of the trusted traveler, but I think we talked about how that's a useful concept, but that there are other useful derivative credentials that could indicate something slightly different and have a slightly different set of data that we could add, maybe not wholesale replace the trusted traveler with. So anyway.
I think that's a great point. Steve, are you trying to chime in? Because I see your mic moving, but I don't hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Could you just open up lab result for just a moment?
You betcha.
And scroll down to the list of field names at the bottom.
Oh,
I mean,
I'm gonna scroll aggressively. Sorry, everybody. Sorry. Here we go.
and I guess we could have looked at them above too, but this is fine. So I just wanted to point out that, I feel like these field names are explicit enough that it's reasonably understood what they refer to. But I like the idea of going with, the medical industry is moving towards adopting FHIR, and FHIR has, well-published documentation for different data elements in medical data. And I'm just thinking it might make sense to create a FHIR version of those fields that uses the published FHIR field names.
Yeah, I think
So I'm
we
not
can.
saying this is bad, but I feel like it's slightly arbitrary and is something more or less that we've kind of come up with as opposed to following an industry standard as close as possible. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think we can probably accomplish that by just building a translation table of like, what is this field name known in other standards? That would also apply to standards that predate FHIR as well. And we could build those mappers from what we understand based on those published specifications should translate to this field name. So I think that's a great point. I will just make a note.
I think that part of the translation could be accomplished with the ODCA schema mechanism to help guide the user from something like FHIR, which is hierarchical, to something which is flat, like a verifiable credential. And so that's part of the challenge. And
before you go anywhere, what is ODCA?
I think it's
talking about OCA, overlay capture architecture.
Yeah.
Oh, OCA, overlay capture architecture.
Yeah.
Okay, carry on with your thoughts. Sorry.
The idea of trying to help with mapping is a good idea. To Steve's point, we might be able to adjust names to be even more current with current proposals as well. But I think what we have is not bad. We might be able to find something better. But
yeah, and you can I'll throw out real quick. You can flatten a JSON path that's pretty common, like with for example, Elasticsearch. You can feed whatever kind of JSON you want to Elastic with all kinds of nested structures. And for example, if you had a JSON key called patient, and then underneath patient, you had phone, then it would be patient.phone. So here we have underscores in the field names, and you would generally just do a period to represent a nested field under another field. Assuming that we were going for following the JSON spec. And that's also what I've seen in some of the fire documentation where they're using the period thing as well for nested things. I could share an example if you want in a bit, but anyway, I didn't want to totally derail us. I just wanted to throw out that idea.
Yeah, I think that's great. We can definitely explore that. To Mike's point, we haven't changed these in quite some time. And I think from a healthcare perspective, it's, we're all sort of hoping that fire is the magical thing that solves some of our challenges in the healthcare space. And we're still waiting and watching whether that's gonna win the standards battle. It seems that way, and I think certainly more so now than a year ago. And so we can absolutely revisit this and think about changing some of the language in these schemas, which don't necessarily change the content of our design. Okay.
One quick comment too, just to
Yeah.
add to what Ken said, making sure that the consent function is built out as well as possible, just because in these scenarios and others that we've discussed in other meetings, that consent will be really important. I think there will be multiple layers of consent, and the configuration or the end goal of each consent may differ. And just for example, I was thinking, I attended a meeting last week where the new updated privacy laws for Connecticut and Utah and changes to other privacy laws. Like, this is very much a moving target. So those consents will be imperative, how they're designed, and then of course how we execute multiple consents at some point in the future.
Absolutely. I'm involved in several consent work groups. It is the problem to solve, I think, nationally, at least in the US, and probably in other areas as well. So having some architecture to support that through this Cardea model would certainly be helpful. I think that's a really important one. Thanks, Christy.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let me back up and let's visit our trusted traveler credentials. So I agree with you, Mike. I don't think we want to replace this. I think we want to add an additional or multiple additional ones for derivative credentials that might function. And maybe we can come up with a neutral enough single derivative credential that it could support a variety of use cases similar to what we've been successful in doing with these original clinical credentials. So in terms of the purpose of this derivative credential in our use cases to date, the point is to communicate, and others can chime in here as you'd like. I think the point is to communicate that you have met the fill in the blank health criteria and are okay to, or maybe not okay, to move on to the next thing that you might be verified for. So for example, if we pick a non-travel use case, and let's talk about the employment use case, you may verify your health credential and be issued an you passed your health requirement to be able to work in the hospital setting. So when you show up for work at the front desk at the hospital, they don't need to know, or your direct supervisor doesn't need to know the details of your lab tests. They just need to know, are you allowed to be out here in the hospital floor today or not? So that derivative credential can say, I'm cleared to work because I've met my criteria. Something along those lines. Again, that's specific because that says I'm cleared to work. So it could be even more neutralized to say, I've met my health criteria. That's it. And then the definition of what it means to meet that health criteria can be determined by the initial verifier. I can just go back to the workflow for a second to show this. This initial verifier would determine what it means to meet your health criteria. And they would be the one issuing your derivative credential that would then be verified, for example, by the person making your work schedule. Any comments on that use case we're trying to solve for?
I think the use case is pretty clear. Perhaps a candidate for the new credential name could be an authorization credential. I don't know if that's too broad.
Health authorization? Do we want to keep it health-based?
It might be for other purposes besides health authorization. Even in our use case in Aruba, they combined elements that were non-health related, such as purchase of insurance or filling out an embarkation, debarkation card that had nothing to do with health. But that I'm trying to find something that's broad enough to catch our current use cases and expand into the future ones as well. It could be
And
authorization for anything. It could be something else. We could name it something less related to authentication authorization to avoid confusion.
Okay. And I think that example, the Aruba example, also applies if we were to go back to the employment use case, right? If you're a clinical staff person, you need to, for example, have your TB test. You also need to not be on the naughty list of the Inspector General in the US. You also need to have malpractice insurance, right? There's a slew of things that need to exist for you to be considered A-okay to step on the hospital floor. So that concept of being able to merge all of those concepts together certainly exists in all these use cases we're talking about. So maybe any other ideas on name? Otherwise, for the first time ever, I'm going to say maybe we can name it later and talk about the content first. Okay, let me scroll down and show you all what we had in the trusted traveler concept, and we can start to spec out what we think this travel neutral derivative credential should have. So if we sort of start with this as our baseline, it has the sort of very high level demographics, those that are sort of could be verified by an ID or something else that are not, they don't identify you from phone or address, for example, so they can't physically find you if there were some exposure of this data. Are there any questions about the core demographics? I consider that, just for everybody's eyeballs here, that is these things here. Should we kind of just carry those over and we can just eliminate the traveler prefix?
Carry them over to, are we talking about what goes from here to a generic credential?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
A generic derivative credential, to clarify.
Sure. Yeah, these fields were meant to be just enough demographics to be able to show that this trusted traveler or this derivative credential was issued to someone unique from the other derivative credential. So it's pretty minimal. I think that the country and origin country, in this case, were actually specific to travel.
Agreed.
And so those
certainly origin country is. And I would think that in a derivative credential, country could also, in theory, be something that somebody who in the wrong hands could kind of discriminate against. I think we might want to nix both country and country origin. Yeah,
I think for a more broadly applicable derivative credential, you probably want to take those out, those two, the country and origin country. But these other ones are, bare minimum to be able to prove someone is different than someone else, and to be able to contact them in a fairly, I guess, inoffensive or in not so intruding way.
Okay. Other comments on the demographic portion of this? Okay, just for reference, in our renaming, we
I'm
called.
sorry to interrupt. Quick
Go ahead, Christy.
question. I just want to know if this is relevant. So at some point, again, just thinking of data privacy laws and collection of information, the country of origin or at least residence would be important to know how to treat that information. Is that inside the scope of this conversation, outside the scope, relevant?
You mean in terms of honoring the privacy rules?
Right, exactly. Essentially complying with privacy requirements, country to country or state to state.
Chrissy, you may know more on this, so maybe you can give us a quick education. I don't know that those rules follow people.
They do right now in European Union, and I need to double check California. Obviously, California's Privacy Act applies to residents, people who are living in California. I don't think it applies to people who don't. But in Europe, the place of collection matters. So for example, this is definitely outside this use case, but something that I've contemplated for a number of years is if there's an athlete that say is from the UK, and this is a real scenario. I'm not making it up. This is a real scenario. A US football player from the UK playing for a US football team who has an exhibition game in Europe, whose privacy and data laws apply? Is it the US? Is it the state where the team resides? Is it the UK where the player is from? Is it Europe where the data is collected? Well, what we know for sure is it is Europe where the data is collected. And then, there has to be some type of rule tree to follow. But that's just one example of, and a complex example of a problem to solve. But for most purposes, it probably would only matter for now whether the athlete plays in California or not and resides in California or not. And then as name, image, and likeness legislation is created and changing constantly throughout the United States, where an athlete resides or goes to school or plays might come into play. And if you're Michigan, University of Michigan football, which is one university that's had a wearable tech agreement with Nike for several years, who owns what data where, and so where that student athlete is from may be important. It may be less important if they're only playing in a state, for a school in a certain state, but if they go to a different state, what rules will apply. So that's all kind of being fleshed out. But you have privacy laws that vary state to state, and you have name, image, likeness laws that vary state to state, which are somehow aligned but not clearly defined with the right of publicity that varies state to state.
Mike, did you have a comment you wanted to make? Thank you, Christy, for explaining that to us, first of all.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's really helpful to think about. And just a couple comments here. In the context of the credential that the individual holds, that's pretty compatible with privacy law because they're choosing with whom they're sharing that credential. And if they don't like that data existing in their device, then they can just hit the delete button. So the issue becomes then, the individual is in control of that portion of it, and it's fully privacy law compliant. I can't think of a law draconian enough to say that that's not good enough, that the individual can delete their own data and they're choosing who they share it with. So the individual, or the issue becomes, how do you make sure that the other parties that have the data involved are behaving? So for example, if the issuer is, under certain circumstances required to delete or be careful with how they would share the database of information they have on hand. Or if a verifier receives data from a credential, how are they, how are things governed with what they do with it later? And the way we're attempting to solve that particular issue is if you use a machine readable governance system, then you can use that tool to look up the DID of a particular agent, whether it be an issuer or a verifier, and see which jurisdiction it operates in, and have some linkage to either human readable laws or the machine readable rules that say how that agent is supposed to behave, and then say under which jurisdiction they're operating, and to be able to find out a little bit of information about that particular DID, whether they're acting as an issuer or a verifier. And so I think where the context or jurisdiction switching that we're talking about, where you say we have an athlete who comes to the United States from Europe, then they would be interacting with agents that are based in the United States, and their policies, the ones that apply to that jurisdiction, would be part of the consideration. And that the other part of the consideration would be, you could look up the issuer of that credential to say this data is originating from Europe, and therefore the local US jurisdiction, whatever, would have to take into consideration the applicable European privacy law. Now, to be fair, that's kind of an ideal world in the future. Is everyone going to have machine readable governance applied, or a good listing of info about their DID or whatever? Maybe not universally. So I would, maybe we should, there is the possibility that we should look at maybe a field or two that says, here are some clues about the origin of this data, where you can track down, what law might be applicable, at least in the origination use case, because in the case where the person's handing out the data, then it's probably the local jurisdiction that's important, but they may not be able. That's easy to discover in the moment you're looking at the data, but the origin of the data might be tricky to find. So, is this governance applied flagged here enough, or do we need maybe just a country? But to Keela's earlier point, maybe the country can be used to discriminate. So those are some ideas about the specifics of a verifiable credential system as applied to privacy.
I think there's a lot of nuance here. So for example, as somebody who works in healthcare, almost all of my contracts in the US say that I can only access the data in territories governed by US law. Because, for example, if I access that sensitive data in another country, my access and whatever happens with that data is governed by their laws instead of my home country or where that data resides. It's based on where it was accessed, for example. So I think each of those rules and nuance, there's going to be just so many nuances as these laws evolve. I think, Chrissy, your information here is super valuable because it's from a specific angle. What I would think about is, so first of all, what I'm hearing is perhaps it's actually not the derivative credential where this matters, but the initial credential to track something about who, based on who issued it, what are the privacy considerations that need to be honored when it is, let me just go back to our other diagram, when it is initially analyzed, because that's when the sensitive data is being reviewed and shared.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, the derivative credential in theory is saying we don't need to keep sharing the sensitive stuff. I'm just going to say this person has the thumbs up, they're good to go. You don't need to know anything else. And so I think your points are well made, and they should be evaluated and revisited on all of the original clinical data schemas.
So
Okay, thanks. That makes sense. And going back to Mike's point about machine readable governance or machine readable, I think that's what he said,
Yes,
rules.
that's
There will be an overlay of rules just like that that are outside the scope of the national or state laws, because each, say, athletic conference in college sports or professional league or association or youth sports league will have their own rules that would apply. For example, in professional baseball several years back, well, first of all, we know athletes, whether college or pro level, get traded all the time. So they could have all of this data collected in one state or through one team or one verifier. And then that could all change when they're traded multiple times during a season. So that's where machine readable rules will be important. And then also in college sports, where you have the NCAA is one form of governance, an athletic conference is another form of governance, a university is another form of governance. And I'm a fan of simplification. So I'm not putting these nuances out there to say, this is what we need to consider and solve for all of these immediately. I want simplicity, and it sounds like that's what you're aiming for, just giving you these comments as food for thought, because it will apply in monetization and commercialization of data. But first, of course, it's going to apply to that personal health information that's collected and used by teams and coaches to optimize athletes and their teams.
I think it's interesting to note that although we can eliminate the personal health information from the derivative credential, we probably will still have some personally identifiable information in there. Their name and date of birth, for instance, are fields that are protected to some degree under GDPR or California regulations as well, where there are, even though we've eliminated the fact that it's the results of a particular test, and that's no longer there, we still have personally identifiable information in the derivative credential.
Yeah, and that will be key at some point when you're commercializing some of this data. Keela, one quick question, since you mentioned that you're dealing with health information regularly. I was wondering, sorry, my dog came in and I got distracted and
okay.
I forgot my question, but if it comes to mind, I'll bring it up again. But
Okay.
tracking data, personal health information and tracking data. Even now, it seems jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what can be done with that data would be different. And that's accurate, right? That's your experience?
Well, yes and no. It's interesting because, and I think it was Mike who was commenting, right? As a person with, right, I'm the patient / person who has these credentials in my wallet, and I'm choosing with whom to share that data, right? Now, maybe my choice, like terms and conditions in something are like not really my choice. I can either do the thing I want to do or not. Still, that's my choice. The reality is that I'm accepting the verifier's terms when I agree to share my credential, whether it's the initial healthcare-based credential or a derivative credential. I'm effectively consenting and acknowledging, agreeing to share with them that information. What their policies and procedures are in terms of how they then retain, redisclose, etc., that information is part of the trust ecosystem and the policies and procedure layer, the governance layer of who's allowed in, based on the established rules of the road. So that's a little bit nuanced, because you might want to say, you country that doesn't agree to meet the policies and procedures of this trusted ecosystem are not allowed to play. Or to be in this ecosystem, you're agreeing to meet the terms of GDPR, whether you're in Europe or not.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And then have you run into biometric data laws at all in what you're doing? Illinois is most robust and most annoying to most big companies, but there are a handful of other states that have biometric data laws.
Yeah, I will certainly do a little
Okay.
research. Let me make a note.
And I can send you a couple links to make your research easy. But I think there's a handful, less than 10 states that have biometric data privacy laws that restrict collection, use, and dissemination, etc. I'll send you a link to maybe make your life easier.
Would love that.
Thank you.
So to kind of summarize, we are very interested in being privacy aware and applicable law aware. But I think for a lot of those issues, certainly most of those issues, they probably aren't solvable within the schemas of the credentials themselves. It's typically going to be applied at the governance layers, whether they're machine or human based, and the jurisdictions where things are taking place, and applied to the servers rather than the individuals.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thanks for keeping me on track.
No problem. It certainly doesn't, and I'm just battling with uppercases here. It certainly doesn't negate the fact that we may want to consider a field to help support those concepts. So I just, as I've been jotting down sort of the translation here, I'm putting a privacy consideration generically labeled thing for us to noodle on as a group, and what that might look like and mean if we had some kind of field to help indicate those sensitive areas. Okay, so just given our short amount of time left, I just want to go through what I've jotted over here. So we have the demographics minus a few from our trusted traveler example. I've added this kind of placeholder for do we want something with a privacy consideration. We have issuance date, expiration date. Those are direct crosswalks over. As these ones all here highlighted are just crosswalked over from the trusted traveler. So I think the one that I can think of that might be missing is potentially something that indicates what this is doing. Maybe rather than the field name, the schema name, maybe it's a field in the schema that says what it's doing. So I don't know if that's just for discussion, maybe that's purpose, right? And this could be, for example, work authorization, school authorization, just as like values in here. So you kind of understand the purpose of this. Thoughts on that concept? In healthcare, other schemas and use cases, this would be called purpose of use, which maybe we don't want to use because it's used in other terms and interactions, but conceptually, that's sort of what I was thinking.
That's pretty good. It's a good way to say we can be more specific with by using a particular value of an attribute rather than having to hard code that purpose into the name of the schema or something like that. That's actually pretty good.
Thank you. Other thoughts on fields that should be in a derivative credential that we haven't highlighted here yet? We've solved it already. Look at that. One meeting, that's all it took. Okay, well, in previous credential discussions, we were using an Excel table to talk about like what we thought the content of the field should be, and et cetera. So I think what we can do for our next discussion on this topic, we can get this moved into that that table format, make sure we are comfortable on how each of these fields would be used. There's not a lot of new here, so that should go really quickly, and then we can get it translated up onto to the GitHub if there are no other ideas or objections to that.
I think drafting that out and then reviewing it one more time might be an appropriate step.
Excellent. Okay, and then I think that the follow-on conversation to that, and maybe this can be touched on next week in our technical agenda, is what does it mean to have this new schema? what does it take to add a new schema to our ecosystem here, and sort of bring awareness to that process, because perhaps this won't be the only schema that we add. I hope it won't be over the course of the evolution of Cardea. And I think being able to understand what it means to add a new schema would also be really helpful for all of those involved as a next week agenda item.
Cool.
Any other comments? Otherwise, we can adjourn with a minute or two to spare here. Ken, did you want to, is there anything we should relay back to this group from the steering committee for those who are not attendees at both places?
Just a quick update that the proposal to expand the use cases by extending the current code to include workplace and educational uses was approved, and so full steam ahead.
Excellent. With that, thank you, Christy, for those links. With that, I think we're good with today's agenda, and we look forward to seeing you all next week for a slightly more technical dive into these things.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.